Hey everyone. So in this video, I talk with a few friends about the movie Blade Runner. It is the 40th anniversary of the film's release, I believe, and we talk about various aspects of the film. Now, for those who don't know, Blade Runner is a movie based loosely on a Philip K. Dick short story or novelette called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And in the movie, the original version of which was released in 1982, a group of synthetic human beings called replicants escape from off world colonies and return to Earth in search of their creator to extend their life. These individuals are slaves, and the world, or the Earth that they find themselves visiting, is in complete or nearly complete ecological collapse. And that is the setting of the movie. Now, that sounds quite simple, and for many people, that may not be enough to pique your interest, but there are many themes within themes in this movie, and many different ways of looking at it. So, in this conversation, I had the great pleasure of speaking with three individuals. Dr. Robert Bishara. Robert is the author of works such as a translation of fundamentalism and secularization by the Egyptian scholar Murad Wahba. Robert is an artist, a composer, whose most recent work, whose most recent musical effort, I should say, is an album called Horny Cricket, which I'm really looking forward to. It's a great name for an album, by the way. And Robert's work can be found at his website, which you can see right here. Also spoke with Matthew Flisfeder, who is the Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Communications at the University of Winnipeg, and the author of, among other works, Postmodern Theory and Blade Runner. And that book, actually, which came out, I believe, in 2017, forms sort of the foundation of our conversation. And we start with Matthew as he walks us through the book and the themes and what inspired him to apply postmodern theory to Blade Runner and how it turned out to be a very rich target, so to speak, for a postmodern analysis. And Matthew's website, where you can see all of his works, is here. And finally, but certainly not least, is R.C. Charles Roberts. Charles is an internet polemicist, a student, I would say, of the traditions of Jean-Paul Sartre, Wilfred Bion, Gore Vidal, H.L. Mencken, to name a few of the luminaries who occupy what Robert calls his writer's table. He writes primarily for a Substack called Ferocia Animi, and you can follow Robert's work here. So anyway, that's the cast of individuals, along with yours truly, of course, who participated in this conversation. I think it was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a great deal, and well, I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. Great to have you with
Hey,
me. So, Matthew, let's start with you. I actually had an opportunity to read your book. And by the way, at the end of this, I will put information about Matt's book on the screen. So look for that. I think it's a fantastic book. And so I'd like you to actually give us a bio about yourself and your work beyond that book, and then talk what led you to create the book. And it's been several years since you wrote it, but yeah, what is it about Blade Runner that actually inspired you?
Sure. Yeah.
No, thanks for that introduction, Dwayne. I'm very, very happy to be here. And even though it's been several years since the book came out, I always love talking about Blade Runner. It is one of my favorite movies of all time. So, just a little bit about myself. I am an associate professor of rhetoric and communications at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. I'm originally from Toronto. My work deals mostly at the intersection of Marxism and psychoanalysis and media communication studies. I've written about, I have books on Slavoj Žižek and film and media. Blade Runner was my third book. My most recent book is a book called Algorithmic Desire Toward a New Structuralist Theory of Social Media, which it tries to use the way that Žižek and his Slovenian neo-Lacanian and German idealist comrades try to rethink um, um, Marxism and psychoanalysis, and Lacan largely by reinterpreting the works of German idealist philosophers Hegel and Kant and so forth. So I apply this to a reading of social media to try to think about what are the potential emancipatory possibilities of the medium. In my current work, I'm trying to go against the structuralist school of thinking, and I'm trying to rebuild and renew a new conception of universal and dialectical humanism. So that's a project that leads out of some of my reading. In fact, Frederick Jameson's writing on postmodernism and a concept that he calls the hysterical sublime, which he uses really as a kind of a shorthand, a way of thinking about how technology comes to stand in postmodern capitalism as a representation or a displacement of the crises or contradictions of capitalism itself. And in the context of the popularity today of so-called Anthropocene discourse and posthumanism, I'm trying to use this idea of the hysterical sublime, which substitutes technology for capitalism. And I'm arguing that in the context of Anthropocene and posthumanist theory, it's the figure of the human and the human subject that has come to be a displacement of the crises and the contradictions of capitalism itself. So in a lot of my recent work, I'm trying to revive interest in ways to think about universal and dialectical humanism, not just as a moral or ethical category, but also as a category that I think is very useful in scientific socialism, and a way to rethink a way to organize a kind of a materialist socialist politics for the present. So the Blade Runner book, Postmodern Theory and Blade Runner, is a book. So I was invited, Todd McGowan, who is the general editor of the series Film Theory and Practice with Bloomsbury Publishing. Todd, who is a big figure in Lacan and Zizek studies today, and somebody who's been very supportive of myself and my work since I started my career. Todd invited me to contribute to the series. And immediately, so at the time, I was reading a lot of Frederick Jameson's writing, Marxist interpretation of postmodernism. And so I was really, really excited to write something about postmodern theory. And Blade Runner just seemed like a natural fit for me. It's a movie that I probably first saw right before the director's cut. So I was too young to see the original in the theatrical release, but I did see the original probably around 1991 probably at a sleepover party with friends on VHS, and I immediately loved it. I've always been a fan of sci-fi, cyberpunk, dystopia. That was probably one of the first sci-fi, dystopia, cyberpunk movies that I'd seen, and it would introduce me to a whole range of other cyberpunk films that I would come to still love. Tron, Total Recall was another one that I was really into at the time. And then, of course, when the director's cut came out, I was very excited and intrigued, of course, by the changes that we will talk about it in our conversation. The changes in the different versions of the movie really have important conceptual and philosophical impact on the perspective that comes out of the narrative of the film. So in thinking about Blade Runner, it just seemed like a natural fit for writing about postmodern theory. And what I try to do in the book is part of the series is to introduce and explain a particular theory or theorist, and then use the
Mm-hmm.
theory or theorist to do an interpretation or analysis of particular films. So in my book, the first half is not just an explanation of postmodern theory, but an interpretation and a critique of postmodern theory, which then in the second half of the book, I apply to reading and interpretation of Blade Runner in different ways. But the general argument that I try to make in the book, so it's not simply a textbook, but what I try to argue in the
Mm-hmm.
book is that Blade Runner actually teaches us something about the historicization of postmodern theory and its applicability to understanding our contemporary context in 21st century neoliberal capitalism. So that's
Well,
just
this is
a
what I loved. Well, this is what I loved about when I was reading your book. I absolutely fell in love with the way that you presented this because when I first viewed the movie, what struck me, and this was, of course, coming from a kid whose idea of the future was what, like a Star Trek future, the beautiful, a shiny future. And what struck me was, well, this world isn't a shambles. And it was astounding to me that here they're presenting us it via the film with all the technologies, pretty much all the technologies that we were sold as being what we aspire to create, and yet the world is an absolute wreck. But the other thing was that history was colliding with itself, like future, past, all these things. And so I was very struck by the way that you apply postmodern theory to the way to the set design, essentially, of the original film. Because yes, it's almost no place. Like it's all places and yet no place at the same time.
mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, you mentioned Star Trek. I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, but I have a picture in the background on my wall. It's a cityscape of Toronto, but with the USS Enterprise flying in. It was a very close friend back in Toronto. But yeah, one of the things that I still love about Blade Runner, and one of the reasons why I think that it's a very useful model of postmodernism and postmodern theory is because of the way that it deals with history and historicity in very interesting ways. And I'll begin, first off from the, dystopia as genre, because I think that a useful way of thinking the difference between modernism and postmodernism is thinking the difference between the representation of utopia in modern, both in high art and in popular culture. And I think, for instance, Susan Buck-Morss in her book Dream World and Catastrophe is very good on this point in talking about the shared visions of both East and West in the capitalist West and the Soviet Union, the different modernist conceptions of utopia that you get in those projects. And I think that in postmodernism, what you get instead of utopia is dystopia. But I think that dystopia provides a very useful dialectical registration of how we could think the historical present. So not imagining some more perfect ideal vision of the world in the distant future and sometimes in the near future. In the case of Blade Runner, which I think was, it takes place 37 years after
Mm-hmm.
the movie was released. But what dystopia does for us, it kind of tells us if we keep doing what we are currently doing, then this is the shit we're going to end up with if we don't make the changes that we need to change in the present. So right away, dystopia as a genre in cyberpunk, I think, provides a very useful historical picture that is applicable to understanding postmodern theory. But then in other interesting ways too, the way in which the film combines different genres from the early moments of cinema. So the film noir, but also other types of science fictions, combining science fiction and film noir. The hard-boiled detective story that gives us a kind of a representation of the history of the film itself. That it's through the analysis of the genre that we can understand something about the historicity, the historical specificity of the film.
Mm-hmm.
But even internal to the narrative, one of the things that I love is that it kind of there's a meta narrative too. And I know in postmodernism you're not supposed to do meta narrative, but there's an important meta narrative that takes place in the way that the film speaks to how we represent and document history. One of the examples in the film is the way that the character Rachel gains a sense of her own self and her own memory by objectifying it into the form of photographs of her mother. That to prove that she's not a replicant, that she's a human, the evidence, the documentary evidence, are the pictures she has of herself with her mother. But when Deckard tells her that, that's not really her, it's Tyrell, the creator of the replicants, it's actually his niece in the pictures. It's a way of troubling the documentary evidence that we use, that we concretize our sense of not just broader history, but personal history, and undermining that, right? That's something that's key to the way we think postmodernism and postmodernity, is the way that historical meta-narratives are troubled in a certain sense by challenging and critiquing the way in which we document, the documentary evidence that we use to support the historicity of our being, right? So in all of these different ways, it's layered. The historicity of the film is layered in these different ways. But in that sense, I think that it provides a very useful way of, to use a term from Frederick Jameson, a way of to cognitive mapping, right? To do cognitive mapping of our postmodern present.
Well, and also I was really fascinated by the way that you described in the book how the film's editing history itself reflects sort of the postmodern moment, because you have the original theatrical release, which of course I saw when it was new, and then the director's cut, and then the so-called final cut. And so we have this film. The film itself it's never ending in a way. And 2049 is an entirely different situation. But yeah, it's within the same stream, I might think.
Yeah, no, so just to speak to that for a second, sorry, I just want to turn off my distractions there. Just in that, so in the yeah, you're right. So just to explain that a little bit. So in the book, I talk about how there's an overlap in 1982 with the emergence, the rise of neoliberal capitalism and Reaganism, and then the director's cut in 1992. So shortly after the end of the demise of the Soviet Union and I guess you'd say the end of the Cold War, and then the final cut kind of comes up, this rise of the far right, the alt right, the Donald Trump kind of moment. So it periodizes it in that sense. No, it's just I think I finished what I was saying. It was just the way to think the historicity of the film in another way that you can periodize. I think that I even put it not just the 2017 as the rise of the alt-right and Donald Trump. I think even when I wrote the book, I think it was actually even before Donald Trump was elected. But in the book, I do make a comparison between Frederick Jameson's postmodernism and then the late Mark Fisher's capitalist realism.
You do, so, yes, you do indeed.
Mark Fisher, when he talks about capitalist realism in the small book of the same name, he's describing. He draws on Fred Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. I think the original phrase comes from Jameson and. I think one of his postmodern books in the 90s, or the phrase that it's easier, it's been boiled down to, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So for Mark Fisher, the way to think about, we've moved past a moment of postmodernism. And I think the way Fisher describes it is that postmodernism emerges still within the context of the Cold War, where there is still this sort of conflict between the two sides, but postmodernism for Fisher ends once the Cold War has ended, and we've now arrived at this moment, what he calls capitalist realism, which is kind of this position where we just imagine the capitalism is here to stay. The realism involved is, he says, when many people on the progressive left, if you want to call it that, say, we could have this better world, and then people on the the liberals or the right will snap back and say, oh, come on, be realistic. That can't happen. Right. Yeah. So for Fisher, we've moved out of postmodernism. We've moved into capitalist realism. And I kind of say that the release of the final cut version sort of coincides with this end of postmodernism and this arrival of 21st century capitalist realism.
You make a point when talking about the different edits of I guess you could say the increase of the ambiguity I believe it's in the director's cut, of Deckard's status.
Yeah.
Is he a human being, or is he a replicant? And which, of course, many people have debated, over the decades. And I'm curious about, wondering if you could expound a little bit on the significance of that small, but and also the removal of the happy ending from the original theatrical release, which I'll tell you that when I saw the movie originally, and then they're just driving off in that, goofy car, in the countryside, and Rachel's hair is blowing. I'm like, what, what's good?
Yeah.
What happened to the completely, destroyed world that they left behind? It's so
Yeah.
yeah. Could you spend on that a little bit?
Even the backstory to the reasons why you have that tacked on ending in the original is kind of interesting, and it actually even speaks in some ways to the context of postmodern works of art, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I guess a classic comparison you can make is sort of the elitism of the Frankfurt School, which tries to justify high art as emancipatory versus the commodified mass culture of the culture industry, of popular culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one way you can think about postmodernism, I think, is to conceive it as this moment when the division between high art and mass culture has dissolved. So that if you think about modernism as a movement in art, modernism is almost can be understood as having a vocation to not commodify. It's trying to constantly escape commodification. So the various different formal aspects, not just commodification, but even technological innovation. So you can think about the rise of modernism in the mid-19th century as, with the way that in visual art, Impressionism emerges at the moment when photography comes out. So that in order for art to maintain its significance, its relevance, it has to transform itself at a formal level. And the more it's integrated and commodified back into the market, the more it has to find new innovative ways to change and transform. So, it goes through the various, Impressionism, Surrealism, Dadaism, futurism, various different avant-gardes, abstract expressionism, but pop art, right? Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, for instance, is this, you kind of see it as this moment when the distinction between high art and mass culture dissolves. So it's this moment when you can't escape commodification, right? I'm sorry, I'm distracted, and I'm trying to remember what my train of thought was.
No, that's fine, because what I asked was about the
right. So the
significance.
tacked on ending. Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, that's almost a product. You see the way in which art is integrated into the market. And the difference between, one of the other ways you can think about the difference between high art and mass culture is that high art, you almost have the sense of, it's produced by the artist, right? The artist slaves at the work, makes the work, creates the work, and tries to throw it out into the world in some way, but it's very much expressive of the artist's own inner sense of being, of self, of projecting, their vision of the world. But that's different than art that's created for the market, which is not created for the author or the artist themselves, but it's created to satisfy the interests and the needs of the buying audience. So, you have movies that are, put, tested, test audiences, and did test audiences like this aspect? Did they not like that aspect? And I think one of the things with Blade Runner was that they didn't like, it was like a depressing kind of ending. So it was almost this weird thing of tacking on this happy ending at the end, which made it, moved out of dystopia and into utopia. One of the other things that was part of the that was tacked on was a kind of a voiceover narration. I think there's only 12 instances in the original film of voiceover narration that was, again, reminiscent of the older film noir genre, where you have, the detective who's narrating the story. And that's actually, it's something that I still kind of like about the original, and that's something I would have kept. But the major difference, of course, in the director's cut, and then, of course, in the subsequent versions, is they removed, again, it's interesting that after it's screened, people didn't like the tacked on ending. They got rid of it. And what they did was they added in, there's a moment where Deckard is sitting at a piano and he's kind of like falling asleep, and then he's sort of daydreaming. And you see that he's dreaming of a unicorn. right? You seem
Yes.
like there's a unicorn running through, and there's in the original film even there's a point at the end where one of the characters, Gaff, one of the inspectors, he throughout the movie he's making little origami figures, and he puts down a unicorn at Decker's apartment, and Decker finds it. But the unicorn origami it has more meaning when you see the dream sequence of the unicorn, because it kind of makes us think, just as Rachel's memories were implanted, is it perhaps the fact that Deckard's dream of the unicorn was implanted? So it forces us to question Deckard's humanity. Is he human or is he a replicant, right? And that's where the debate comes in. One of the things that I think actually is great about questioning Deckard's humanity, and it doesn't do it in an overt and direct way, but if you think about the contrast between Deckard and Roy Batty and the other replicants, it not just racism at the level of xenophobia, but at the level of kind of biological determinist, questioning, what makes a person a slave and what makes a person free, right? Is a person, because the replicants are basically slaves in the off-world colonies, right?
Yes.
And it adds an important, I think, political dimension to the film about not just the laboring body, but also the way in which the body can be used in a particular way to subjugate some beings to exploitation and oppression versus others, right? So I think in the director's cut, when you kind of start to think, is Deckard a replicant, it gives more an added sympathy. I think there was already sympathy there for Roy Batty before, but I think there's other levels of sympathy that we give to the replicants where they're made out to be the villains, but in fact, well, maybe we should be on the side of the replicants. They are the exploited, oppressed laborers that are really just trying to gain their freedom.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. Well, you know what? We'll hear more from Matt a little later, but I want to move to Robert before getting to Charles. And Robert, your approach to, at least in this conversation, to the film is to talk about your memories of the film, actually, which seems appropriate because the film is in a large extent, all about memory. And actually, before you start, let me mention to everyone that Matt's work, I will provide points this particular book, but also to other works from Matt and his website in the show notes, and also you'll see it at the end of this video, and to Robert's work and to Charles's work. Well, and to my work as well. But Robert, I turn the mic over to you to share your impressions.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
And by the way, please provide an intro to yourself for those who are.
Yeah, so I'm an academic that works mainly around critical psychology, psychoanalysis, and decoloniality. But I'm also a fine artist who delves into music, film, and theater. And I remember, Dwayne, that you mentioned when you saw Blade Runner the first time in the theater that it was rainy too, right? You forgot to mention that detail. Right. So that kind of
it was raining
to the mood
and chilly as well. Yeah.
So it was the right mood to watch it. So, and I believe Matt, you watched the film in 91, right? That's the date. And so for me, it was the early 2000s. So we have like different pretty much generations or different decades of enjoyment, right? So yeah, I knew that Matt was going to bring in some heat with the theorizing, so I didn't want to think about that aspect, and I wanted to think more of a personal reflection. 3 memories, 2 in Egypt, 1 in the US. So the first time I saw Blade Runner was actually by chance. There used to be a video store near my parents' place in Cairo called Video Rack, which is obviously now closed, kind of like Blockbuster in the US. And back then, before streaming and whatnot, you'd randomly select a film to watch from a brochure that was printed. And the film back then was on VHS tape, of course. So that's similar experience to Matt's in that sense. So this was in the early 2000s. In any case, I rented this film called Blade Runner. I popped it into the VCR in my room, and oh, did it feel like a rainy day in Cairo? It doesn't really rain in Cairo that much, but it did feel like a rainy day in Cairo. And this is what I remember. I was not ready for the overall dark mood, the depressing dystopian vibes, that I had to continue watching the film from bed, which,
Oh.
by the way, I never do. I never watch any film lying down, but like the film had that immediate effect on me that I had to like lie down on the bed and continue watching it that way. So that first viewing had a big impact on me psychologically, although I had not yet fully digested what the experience had to offer. So since then, I've probably seen the film 20 or more times, and eventually it became an obsession. So that's kind of my first memory with the film. And the second one, in 2008, I produced one of my plays in Cairo, and it was titled Infinity, a multimedia experience in 7 colors. Inspired by Japanese theater director Tadashi Suzuki, I decided to rehearse with the actors all summer without a script, and then introduce a text a month before the opening night, which was a radical thing to do. So the idea was to train the actors physically and psychologically through dance, yoga, and all kinds of other experiences over the summer of 2008. And one of my assignments for the actors was for them to watch Blade Runner, which was a major reference for my play, which happens to be sci-fi. The actors found the film boring, which is something we can get into because obviously the film does have a slow pace. But it's so aesthetically engaging that, of course, I don't know, personally find it boring. But it's a good question to raise today about this, how it's received for newer generations, younger generations. But obviously, it's a demanding film, particularly the first viewing. And for me, the score by Vangelis was what got me hooked the first time, since I'm also a composer and was already familiar with his work. And by the way, shout out to Vangelis, who recently passed away, an incredible composer, and he was also a member of Aphrodite's Child, along with Demis Roussos.
Yeah.
So that's my second memory, using the film as kind of an assignment, during this production of one of my plays back in Cairo. So that's interesting. I mean, here's someone, an Egyptian, encountering this film and being influenced by it in a completely different context, right?
Yes.
The third significant memory, now this one is in the US, is organizing a watch party at my old apartment here in New Mexico on November 20th, 2019, which is the date supposedly when the actions of the film take place. It felt weird and captivating to watch the film during the time of the story. It's as if we're inside that story, we're living that moment. It speaks to the relevance of the film today and how it continues to resonate with us. Then, of course, you'll probably remember, like a couple of years ago, the California fires footage of that was used and juxtaposed with the opening sequence from Blade Runner. I think someone actually added music. And there's something about that too, how we're living that dystopia today, and the continued relevance and resonance of this film. And as I'm saying this, in New Mexico, there are fires similar to California, but probably they don't get as much media attention because it's not California. But anyways, those are my 3 memories really with the film. I'm glad that Matt touched on this question of slavery at the end, because really, when I watch it more recently, that's the thing that stands out to me, and I would like to see that being more explored, this question of overexploitation and oppression of replicants, and who's human, who's not. And I think it's a very deep theme, because you have the off-world, basically it's a colony, and so I'm glad Matt touched on that.
No, those are fantastic recollections, actually, and they do bring to mind my own memories of the film, which, as I mentioned, and as we talked about, Robert, in another conversation, are quite strong. I mean, no matter how many years go by, I still can bring that memory back to mind quite strongly. There's a couple of films that have hit me like that. Another one is Akira Kurosawa's Ran, which I saw for the first time in a small art house theater in Philly, and I did not know what to expect. And that film also kicked me uh, quite thoroughly in the ass as a cinematic experience, but also just the power of that story. So Blade Runner remains there. I'm really curious about your use of the film in your theater work. So beyond the initial response of "it's boring," was there any other, I would say, impact or any other impression on the actors that you can talk
Yeah.
about?
I mean, think of the context. It's like summer day in Cairo, very hot, right? And here they are sitting down to watch Blade Runner, like a very dark movie, very slow. So it's just like, it feels weird. So it
Yeah.
was hard for them to get into it. They went through it, they got through it, but they didn't really enjoy it. And they were like, why are you showing this to us? But anyways, I mean, I was trying to inspire them and tell them that this is something that inspired me to write the play, one of the references, and this is kind of a mood. But they didn't really get it. So I mean, it's not a film for everyone, and it's important
Yeah,
to
and
say that.
also I think that it's one of those films. I also believe that. I mean, I was quite young and it struck me, but I was a weird kid. I think it's not uncommon, when you're young. I mean, and those of you who are versed in psychoanalytic or psychological theory will probably be able to speak to this at length. But when you were young, it's not unusual to deny the possibility of death. And I mean, we deny the possibility of death all the time, but particularly when we're young and we can do 100 push-ups without thinking about it, and be out all night, eat pizza, and just do just dumb things. And we do literally think we will live forever. And so, if someone's presenting you with this piece of this entertainment, ostensibly, that says, "Oh, you know what? The world is actually coming to a terrible end," and not in a science fictiony way, but in a way that's actually quite tangible. That was the other thing about the film that struck me when I saw it when I was young, and it was so disturbing. If you depict a world of crazy mutants and people wearing wacky costumes and having ray guns, it may depict the end of the world, but it's an implausible end of the world. And even some of the dystopias like Mad Max, at which everyone can still fix an engine, and there's endless refined crude for you to drive your car around in, and your tires still work. That's implausible as well. So you can kind of dismiss that. But a world in which you're walking a street and there are people like you and they're struggling as you may be struggling, and I could clearly see that coming even as a very young person. And I think that's, as I walked out of the theater, that's what shattered me, was that this is like I can smell this place, and I don't think it's possible. I mean, the replicant part's impossible, but the world being in that state is not impossible. And yeah, so I think that as one gets older, like perhaps those same actors in a different place in their lives
Hmm.
might have reacted, some of them anyway, and because as you say, it's not for everyone, regardless of where
Right.
you are in your life.
But you know
But
what? As you were saying
maybe
this, I
some
was
of them in a
thinking
different state.
about how, like, basically that world is a multicultural world, like, how,
Yes,
but it's a nightmare too, right? Because of
yes,
capitalism. I mean, you can have multicultural world within capitalism, it's still a nightmare. And so,
yes.
but that's an interesting aspect to it too, because obviously a lot of Asian references and all of that, but also there's Arabic music in the soundtrack too. So
Hmm,
it
hmm.
incorporates a lot of that stuff. So it's interesting.
I Yeah, that's actually fantastic. And I was wondering if anyone else had any questions for Robert before we move on to Charles, because I can see some resonances, I believe, with some of your work, Matt, and Charles, maybe some with some of your thoughts as well.
I actually really like the last point that Robert was making about the multiculturalism that's represented in
Mhm.
the film. And I mean, On some level, I think. I mean, I kind of read it too. Not in the more in the way that Edward Said sort of responds to Orientalism. That there's sort of an Orientalist, like a critique of Orientalism in a certain way. I think in the film by placing the depiction of of Asian and Arabic culture on the screen, but also set against the background of the very big, high up in the sky, glossy, glitzy, neon screens. But I also like, if you think about the visual metaphor that you have in the film, one of the things that distinguishes cyberpunk as a genre too is the way that it moves past the high up in the skies, Jetsons, utopia type of thing, and goes down into the streets, so that the multiculturalism that we get, you can still see that even on Earth, it's not just only the slavery in the off-world colonies, but there is even sort of a debasing of the racialized other on the streets of Los Angeles, of the dark, rainy Los Angeles on the streets, right? And it's it's not even just in terms of the depictions of race and racialization and racism, but even in terms of the depiction of gender, because even the way in which when Deckard goes into the there's a strip club or a brothel of replicants, that dynamic even comes through in a certain way. So there's I agree with what Robert's saying. I think that it kind of takes to task not just capitalism, but even the liberal form of thinking about multiculturalism, that it's it pays lip service and it's superficial, but when you look at the actuality of the situation, the depiction and the representation of multiculturalism doesn't necessarily get at the heart of the material forms of oppression and exploitation that persist.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me, because that means that the film, in a sense, is operating perhaps accidentally on multiple levels of sort of well, bursting bubbles. I'll just put it, because at one level there's the technological sublime that it shatters, because you have the flying cars, you have the thinking machines, you have all these things, and yet, as we said earlier, the world is still quite terrible, and the role of capitalism in making it terrible is very explicit in this film. But then, as you say, you also have some other aspects, such as multiculturalism, which are presented as a good in and of itself, that therefore produces other things. But under, I would phrase it, the imperial umbrella of a capitalist regime, of a global capitalist regime that has indeed destroyed the world. And I think that 2049, one of the things I loved about that film was that that film takes you to the ultimate. Well, it's not the conclusion. The world's not completely gone yet, but it's almost there. Like that world is even further along the process that is depicted in the original three films. And although I have no love for Jared Leto, who I think probably should be sent to an off-world colony, other than that, I think the film is actually quite fascinating. But before getting into that, Charles, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your work. I have called Charles our new Gore Vidal, because he is trying to resurrect the American literary tradition in that camp, or rather in that category. But Charles, I'll let you talk about yourself, your work, and also how you're approaching this film.
Well, I'm certainly a little bit uglier than Gore Vidal was. So these are some mighty shiny shoes to fill. Nevertheless, let's see where to begin. Well, unlike your other guest, I'm a lowly internet polemicist and literary critic, and I do most of my stuff through Substack, which to some people is hell, and I guess I'd be the devil. So,
well, you are indeed you are indeed in a lair, apparently.
Certainly, this place has the low lighting. One could say it reflects the film of Blade Runner.
It does.
I will say that I only watched the original version, and at that, I wasn't quite paying attention, and it's not because I didn't care about the film. So I'll begin here. So Roy Batty, to a literary person like me, was just the shiniest part of that entire show. And so I was very distracted because, for example, as everybody knows, when he goes and meets the guy who makes eyes, he references William Blake's poem, America Prophecy. Now, I will say, have to be a little bit of a nerd here, but he says, "Fiery the angel," I believe it's "Fiery the angel fell," and in the actual poem, it's "Fiery the angel rose." And it's an interesting misquote because one wonders if it wasn't done on purpose. Because when one looks at Roy Batty, one sees almost a Luciferian kind of character. In a sense, fell to earth, fell to hell, a dystopia. And I don't know if he intended to rule, but he definitely was looking for his creator. So it's doing battle, I guess, with his own creator. So I'll put it that way. So that's the first thing, is Roy Batty definitely had a lot of my attention, not only because as a character he fills a very specific kind of literary archetype that's very interesting. When I first started watching it, I assumed it was going to take the usual Lucifer Promethean path, because usually if there's a Luciferian archetype in a book or a movie, it tends to also be Promethean. They tend to kind of put those side by side. I don't think they do that with Roy Batty. Now, the reason I mentioned I wasn't paying attention is if anybody wants to correct a scene I reference, go ahead, because the thing for me is that whenever I approach something, I tend to read as opposed to necessarily watch the show to try to make a connection with it. And so the first thing I did was I wondered if Blade Runner had any literary connections outside of the sort of Roy Batty being a Luciferian kind of archetype. And I assume, as everybody here knows, it's based on Philip K. Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So while I was supposed to be watching the movie, I went to go look for this book because I'd never read it before. And I was reading it, or reading parts of it, I should say. I unfortunately didn't have the means in which to actually go get this book, at least not before this show. And so I was reading excerpts, and there was some. One of the things I wanted to do was to kind of compare the differences to the film. Now, I know that the film is quite different from the book. As people have noted, there are a wide range of differences. For example, in the book, Deckard has a wife named Iran, I believe is how you say that. And I am reading my notes. I'll throw a joke in from time to. I was going to say I'll throw a joke in from time to time to give it an air of spontaneity. But yeah, he has a wife named Iran who loves this electric sheep, because one of the things that the book emphasizes that isn't really in the movie is that the animals are very scarce. Now, it's not to say that the movie doesn't pay attention to that at all, but it's definitely an emphasis in the book.
Yeah, the emotional impact of that, I think, is emphasized more. It's implied, or the impact of that is implied in the film, but I think that the book hits that note harder.
Right. Well, yeah, it kind of, well, for example, I'm not going to say spoiler alert. This book's been out forever. If it's spoiled for you, that's your fault. But for example, the main goal of Deckard in the book, as opposed to the movie, is he wants to make enough money to get an actual animal. He ends up buying a Nubian goat. which is interesting because the reason I say that it kind of focuses more on nature is one of the things that Rachel does in the book is she comes back and she kills that goat, which I found interesting, because basically this book allows for nature to both be prized but also to be kind of a commodity. It's a status symbol. For example, when in the book Deckard's neighbors, by the way, to set the scene a little bit, in the book, the United States, San Francisco, where where it takes place, is actually more of a nuclear wasteland than the movie. The movie has a lot of people in it, and which is fine. It's obviously it's a loose basis. But in the book, it's kind of a nuclear wasteland. The people who live there, nobody knows why they stayed on Earth. They're actually encouraged to leave. But the animal acts as a sort of a status thing. His neighbor finds out that he has an electric sheep instead of a real one, and he basically has to tell that guy to be quiet about it. Like, he doesn't want anybody else to know. Anyway, but one of the things that stood out to me that can relate directly to the movie here, that was a difference, is there's that scene at the is it a strip club or is it brothel?
Actually, I think it's a strip club because I forget the name of the actress. She's quite famous. But yeah, she's well, as we say, she's working the pole in the club. Yeah.
Right. So the reason that was interesting is that in the book, the closest scene to that actually takes place at an opera house. And so instead of a strip club. And so one might wonder whether Philip K. Dick had a little bit more of a optimistic view of where our culture was going to go.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I found that
it's possible. It's possible to imagine Roy Batty going to the opera, but not Deckard.
Yeah, the reason that that's actually sorry, lost my train of thought here. Yeah, the comparison from the opera house to the strip club was kind of interesting to me because basically one can ask some hypothetical questions. For example, maybe the strip club functions the same way as the opera house might, or maybe fills a similar cultural role, things like that. But it's all hypothetical. But to come back to Roy Batty here, as you noted, when I was watching Roy Batty in this movie, the thing I thought of was Stephen Jay Gould's point when he was asked about Albert Einstein's brain and what it weighed and its convulsions and things like that. Mm-hmm. And he said that he cared less about Einstein's brain and more about the fact that around the world there are people who are just as smart as Einstein, if not smarter, who die in the fields, who die doing the work that sustains our capitalist system, and never get the chance to actually contribute in any intellectual way. And so for me, Roy Batty, outside of being sort of a a Luciferian archetype, sorry, let me clear my throat here. Outside of being a Luciferian archetype, also it seems to me kind of embodies one of the let's say sins of capitalism, in that capitalism doesn't look to bring forth the best of individuals. It looks to exploit, or it looks to bring forth people who know how to exploit the resources that are necessary to keep the system going. And so Roy Batty, both having a limited lifespan and having to face his creator while living in or coming down to Earth where he's being hunted, it kind of is, at least to me, kind of a signifier of capitalism. It's the lie of innovation. We should put it that way, where capitalism isn't about innovating and moving things forward and having better technologies that help more people, kind of what you were talking about with the Star Trek kind of idealism. It doesn't bring out the best, it brings out the stuff that is easiest to exploit, and it elevates people who are good at that sort of exploitation.
And all the innovations that occur, such as they are, have been produced in order to increase the ability to exploit.
Right.
And in fact, the applicants themselves, like, were we to be able to create, such a synthetic life form, it would be an astounding achievement. But then, if you were to reflect and say, "But why was that done?" Well, to create slaves.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And that the other approach I took to this, besides comparing the book, and I decided to kind of skip comparing the book and the movie because I find it interesting, but it might be a tad tedious. Is I always, when watching any movie or reading any book that's dystopian or utopian, I like to take what I would call a Huxleyan approach to it. So, as everybody here probably knows, Aldous Huxley wrote A Brave New World. What a lot of people don't tend to make the connection on is that he also wrote the book Island. And if you read both books, you notice that Island and the place in Brave New World are built with the same structures. They use the same approaches, the same, use of propaganda and things like that. But it's two different societies, one's dystopian and one's utopian. And so for me, any dystopian book is not a refuting of utopia, but it's a completion of the picture. And so if you look at Blade Runner in that way, one might argue that Blade Runner as a dystopia, it isn't saying that, the utopia of capitalism, let's say, can't be achieved. It's saying that this is the way that it is achieved, in a sense.
That's interesting. That's quite interesting.
And so,
because for Tyrell, in a way, that is utopia.
Yes, exactly. And it's unfortunately pretty pessimistic, although I tend to be. But for me, the thing that a lot of people don't understand, whether they're liberals or communists or the right wing, is that they all have a belief that if their society gains the utopia that they desire, the thing that they want, that everything will be good. And unfortunately, I believe that every utopia comes with this dystopia. I think it's impossible necessarily to avoid that.
Well, I mean, indeed, I think it was Vidal who observed that it's not enough that someone wins; someone must lose.
Right.
In many situations, and I think the most savviest manipulators of power understand this, and I think that in a way, some of the reactionaries who, for example, resent the fact that, I don't know, that I'm not toiling in the fields, or that Robert is able to be in the States, that when we say, you're not losing, maybe we're lying to ourselves, because they are losing. Perhaps Robert, you might use this in Lacanian terms, but they're losing some sense of joy, right? By the fact that their utopia, which is them being able to oppress, has been lost.
Right. Well, even in it, to take another literary approach to this, even Sir Thomas More's book Utopia has people within that society that are less than. They are not a part of the people who get all the benefits. For example, one of the people within there, I believe, are atheists, people who don't believe in God. Since, for him, he kind of imagined a Christian utopia. And so this is why, for example, I'm going to bring Wilfred Bion in here, and, the psychoanalyst. Wilfred Bion talked about the notion of what he called a good enough mother. But if you take Bion, you apply him to society, it seems to me that, what we have to understand about utopia and dystopia is that if they are intertwined and you can't have one without the other, then maybe the idea isn't necessarily a utopia or a complete utopia or complete dystopia, but a good enough utopia. Maybe something where it's not so, I don't want to say not so extreme, but something that's not so, I guess, something that's not so utopian that it requires a massive sort of, I would say, sacrifice on the people who wouldn't fit into that utopia, because a utopia never includes everybody.
Interesting.
But that those were kind of the insights I had. Unfortunately, I can't develop it too much more. I wasn't able to read the book fully or watch the movie completely. I had a lot of things to do. So
yeah, that's listen. Life always well,
finds
we're
a
all
way.
living. Yeah, we're living lives. Yeah, we're not getting paid to. Sadly, we're not getting paid to talk about Blade Runner. That would be a utopian job, perhaps. But
unless we are, of course.
Yeah. Well, the check is in the mail.
I just wanted to jump in quickly. Just one thing that obviously you were saying about utopia, and I always try to remind people that the contradiction in the term itself, because utopia means both good place and no place. So that when we're talking about utopia, I mean,
right.
Even it's the question of, in going back to even something like Plato's Republic, if we're talking about something that is materially possible, or if it is, an ideal form that we're talking about as simply like a regulative idea against which we can determine or suggest or propose and understand and critique the things that are problematic of the world today. So we need the idea of the absolute in order to understand where we find the failed absolute. That the only way we can get a sense of what we need or what is necessary is by thinking about how we're failing to attain the thing that we say that we want. And there's of course the psychoanalytic aspect to that too, is when we think about the relationship between desire and enjoyment, that desire only exists insofar as we can never actually attain the object we think that we want, while at the same time, in the form of something like the death drive, we're still getting forms of enjoyment that we don't even realize we're attaining. Right, that it's in the pursuit of the thing that we're getting the enjoyment, rather than the acquiring of the thing that we think that we want. So, I mean, there's an interesting play on that in the way we think about utopia, both as we're not getting the ideal, but at the same time that we're not getting the ideal, we realize that the ideal is itself, in a way, just a matter of allure.
Right. I can definitely see that. That actually made me think of something in Jean-Paul Sartre's Truth and Existence. And he talked about existence as always being at a distance, or I'm not existence, enjoyment always being at a distance. You always enjoy something until you have it, so to speak. That kind of I should probably put it this way. That definitely makes me come back to Wilfred Bion's concept of good enough. The idea of, in our case, a good enough society, where, as you said, utopia might not be about the object, but about the allurement, about the ideal. I guess how to approach this, because if utopia is a good place and no place, I wonder what that makes dystopia, because if we were to assume that dystopia is the opposite, which is, that would mean it's the bad place and it's every place, everywhere. I guess in existential terms, it would just be the idea that utopia is the attempt and usually the failure to move from a bad place that's everywhere to a good place that's nowhere. And I find that pretty interesting. I would have to actually sit on that for a little bit here, but
Yeah, that's absolutely a thought that I think is worthy of further development. And perhaps you will do us the honor of gracing us with an essay about that, because and all about Roy Batty. I would love for you to write about Roy Batty, because when you mentioned to me in the chat your impression of Batty, it immediately made sense to me. And I think others, no doubt, have written about Roy, but when I first saw the film, I loved Roy, because I thought, well, and with subsequent viewings, it wasn't just a matter of hating Tyrell because he's, an evil capitalist. It was more that, he's a barbarian. He's a barbarian in the way that we are confronting barbarians today. Like these tech billionaires, or just in general, who we are encouraged to worship. But we know that there's a person just sitting in a park somewhere who's orders of magnitude more civilized than these individuals, who are just underdeveloped and dull. And it's not that there's nothing genetic about it. It's that, as they their class interest, this is what required of them, which is to become these kinds of, in a way, machines. I mean, they're still human beings, obviously, playing the role within the class relations.
right.
But yeah, but Charles, I encourage you, because I think everyone would read it, and I certainly would signal boost out of it,
Yeah.
to develop that further, because I think it's quite intriguing.
Right. Yeah. And I think the idea of Roy Batty, I don't know enough about the difference between modernism and postmodernism to say this without having to clarify that I don't know enough. But Roy Batty almost seems to represent, because if I understood Matthew correctly here, modernism was the attempt of art to be outside of commodification, to escape it. And Roy Batty is almost attempting to escape his position as a slave in a capitalist society. And the kind of literary expression of Roy Batty, as far as I'm concerned, is almost, and it probably wasn't planned, but it almost seems to me as an attempt to escape capitalism. And his death ends up with him failing, even though I would say that there's nothing more literary than searching for a way to extend one's life and to grapple with death in a hope to defeat it. And
His final moment, his final moment, is a literary act, right?
Yes,
I mean,
right.
not only does he save Deckard's life, but he does so elegantly,
Right.
And his death is elegant. I mean, my God,
Right.
he could be Lord Byron,
pretty much. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what hit me most about the death was not only the monologue, which I think was very well done, and everybody enjoys it as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think anybody could listen to that and say they're bored. But that's me being a literary snob. Nevertheless, for me, his death was something of how do I put this? Sartre would insist on the optimism of existentialism, for example. But I think that there's an optimism in pessimism or in failure, I guess. And watching Roy Batty be this technically evil, I don't think he's actually evil. I think he's just against society, so to speak. But being, kind of against society, this literary type who's trying to defeat death and failing. It's both optimistic because it shows, you can still try to be a literary type in a capitalist society, but it also shows that it fails. It doesn't leave. It doesn't defeat the capitalist conditions, which is something Sartre ran up against in his autobiography, The Words, where he pointed out that his literary output, his focus on literature was good, but even engaged, it wasn't enough, which is why he made his turn towards Marxism. Because literature, unfortunately, as he put it, is still a bourgeois activity, even as it tries to escape being a bourgeois activity. So,
Well, we are 10 minutes away from our appointed stop time, and I don't want to abuse the time of you good gentlemen. Um, now, I have my own thoughts, but you know what? I've actually enjoyed listening to what um, you guys have been talking about so much that I can leave my thoughts for another time. I will say just this one thing, though, which is that for me, Blade Runner is perhaps alongside LA Confidential the only modern noir. There have been other attempts, but I believe that the movie captures and updates the spirit of noir in what I call the high period, as exemplified by the 1947 Jacques Tourneur movie Out of the Past, starring Robert Mitchum and Jane Greer. And very briefly, what makes that film a noir is not just the tough guy aesthetic or the dark cinematics. It's the fact that no matter what Jeff Markham, the character played by Mitchum, does, his fate is sealed. Um, and also, it reminds me of Blade Runner because, but well, particularly the director's cut, because at the end of Out of the Past, it does not have a happy ending. And similar to the editing history of Blade, the director was pressured by RKO to put a happy ending on, in which Jeff Markham goes off with his pretty small town girlfriend, because in the story he escapes from his big city criminal life and moves to a beautiful little town in late 1940s California. It's very bucolic, and then his path comes back, therefore out of the past. But it ends with him dead, and the woman who loved him in the small town believing that he betrayed her, even though he did not. Like in his death, he actually did something quite noble, but it's never known by anyone except for a person who is deaf and who cannot speak, which can be more almost Greek tragedy than that. So that is, in a very small nutshell, something I'll develop further later. My impression of Blade Runner, that it is indeed a true noir in this sense, but that it uses this environment of ecological collapse to convey this idea. But enough about my thoughts, gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk about this. I really, really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Dwayne.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
enjoyed being here. Really enjoyed listening to what Robert and RC had to say as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, thanks so much.
Oh yeah, I had a good time. I felt like I had to put my floaties on there for a second and wade into the deep end, but here I am on the surface.
No, it's all good. So as I said, at the end of this video, there will be information about the work of everyone who's been featured here. And thanks, everyone, and goodbye.